Night shifts in the hospital had a rhythm most staff stopped noticing after their first year. The monitors hummed at a steady pitch, infusion pumps clicked at predictable intervals, and the fluorescent lights flattened time into something that barely moved. It was not peaceful, but it was consistent, and consistency was what kept people calm. The new nurse did not disturb that rhythm. She arrived early, signed in without conversation, and took the assignment nobody argued over. Overflow observation beds, temporary patients, paperwork heavy, medically stable, the kind of duty that made experienced nurses feel their skills were being wasted. She did not seem disappointed. Instead, she read every chart twice before touching a single patient. When a junior nurse rushed past carrying medications, she stepped aside to give room, then quietly checked the label after the nurse left. A dosage had been entered in pounds instead of kilograms. She corrected the chart without calling attention to it and left a brief note for pharmacy verification, unsigned. No one noticed except the pharmacist, who assumed the charge nurse had caught it. Later, a patient scheduled for transfer to the cardiac step-down unit began showing minor oxygen dips. Nothing alarming. Not yet. The transport orderly was already waiting with a wheelchair. "Give him 15 minutes, the new nurse said gently, adjusting the oxygen tubing. "He just walked from the bathroom. Let's see if he stabilizes." The orderly shrugged. The bed upstairs was needed, and delays created problems. But she spoke without urgency, without authority, just quiet certainty. He waited. 12 minutes later, the patient coughed, producing fluid that should not have been there yet. The transfer order was changed to ICU evaluation. The charge nurse frowned at the chart. "Good catch," she said, not looking up from the computer. "You've been here before?" The new nurse shook her head. No. She did not elaborate. Around midnight, the emergency department sent up 3 admissions in quick succession. That was normal during flu season. What was less normal was that they all came from different neighborhoods but arrived through the same ambulance unit. She noticed because the vehicle ID appeared repeatedly in the intake software. The pattern lingered in her attention long after she finished assessing the patients. She opened the ambulance routing screen, a system most floor nurses ignored, and studied the timestamps. The ambulance had bypassed 2 closer hospitals each time. There could be many reasons: capacity, staffing, equipment. She did not assume error. She wrote the numbers down on a folded scrap of paper and slipped it into her pocket. At 1:14 a.m., she reorganized the supply cart. No one had asked her to. She rotated airway kits closer to the hallway entrance, placed isolation gowns near the central nursing station instead of the storage room, and positioned portable monitors beside beds that did not require them yet. She worked slowly, methodically, never blocking walkways, never interrupting anyone. "Preparing for something?" another nurse joked while passing. "Just making it easier if we get busy," she replied. There was no humor in her tone, but no alarm either. At 1:27 a.m., she called maintenance. Not to report a failure, to ask when the backup generator had last been load tested. The technician hesitated, confused by the question, then answered from the logbook. 2 months ago, within regulation." "Thank you," she said, and hung up. She then unplugged one non-essential warming unit and moved a patient from a window bed to an interior bed under the pretense of comfort. The patient complained briefly about the inconvenience. She apologized and helped settle them with extra blankets. It cost her 10 minutes she did not have. At 1:42 a.m., she approached the charge nurse again. "Do we have an isolation ward ready if intake spikes?" she asked. "We always have rooms," the charge nurse replied, distracted. "I mean immediately ready," she clarified quietly. "Without moving current patients." The charge nurse finally looked at her. "Why?" The new nurse paused, considering how much to say. "Just a feeling about the ambulance routing." The charge nurse almost dismissed it, then noticed the supplies had been reorganized, the portable monitors positioned, the beds subtly redistributed. Preparation without panic. Keep me updated if you see anything else, she said, cautious now. The new nurse nodded and returned to her patients. At 2:03 a.m., a patient asked for water. While assisting, she glanced at the cardiac monitor. Not her patient's, but the neighboring bed. A slight irregularity, too brief to trigger alarms. She adjusted the electrode placement and watched for 30 seconds longer than necessary. The rhythm corrected. She did not record it as an incident. She recorded it as a timestamp. At 2:11 a.m., she unfolded the scrap of paper again and added one more note, cluster tightening. Her break time passed without notice. By 2:30 a.m., fatigue pressed behind her eyes, but she stayed standing. Sitting would slow observation. Standing kept her aware of sound changes, footsteps, carts, ventilation flow. A distant siren approached, then another. She did not react outwardly. Instead, she washed her hands, dried them carefully, and began quietly moving two immunocompromised patients to the far side of the ward under routine justifications. Extra cleaning, better monitoring access, no announcement, no urgency, just preparation. The cost came when a family member objected to the move, angry at the disturbance in the middle of the night. She accepted the complaint without defense, listening until the frustration burned out, then apologized again. It delayed her further. At 2:41 a.m., she finished repositioning the last bed, and only then allowed herself to look at the clock for longer than a second. Her eyes held there, calculating, not worried, confirming. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, engines accelerated, not toward the emergency entrance, toward the city. She returned to the station, picked up a phone, and dialed a number from memory she had not used in years. She listened for 3 seconds, then hung up before anyone answered. No one around her realized the shift had already begun. At 2:52 a.m., the emergency department called before the ambulance doors opened. Not a patient report, a request for available beds without giving details. The charge nurse frowned at the phone. "We need information before assignment." A pause followed. "They don't have it," she said after hanging up. "They're sending them anyway." The new nurse did not look surprised. She only reached for the clipboard and began clearing 2 observation beds that had not yet been discharged on paper. She did not cancel them. She simply completed the remaining steps faster than usual, double-checking identification bands, confirming medications, arranging transport in advance. When the first stretcher arrived, the paramedic avoided eye contact. "No incident location?" the charge nurse asked. "Dispatch error," he replied too quickly. The patient was conscious, breathing normally, vitals stable. Yet the paramedic handed over a sealed bag containing the patient's clothing instead of leaving it at bedside. He signed the form and left before routine questions were finished. The new nurse watched him walk away down the corridor instead of returning to the ambulance bay. The second patient arrived 30 seconds later. Different age, different condition, same ambulance unit number. The third came with a different crew but identical documentation handwriting. The admitting clerk called upstairs. "We're getting multiple transfers. Record system isn't updating. Registration numbers aren't generating." The hospital relied on that system for everything: medication tracking, lab work, imaging authorization. Without it, every department slowed. The new nurse turned to the charge nurse. "We should triage manually until the system stabilizes." "That's an emergency department decision," the charge nurse replied, though less certain now. "They won't have time," she said quietly. "Not if more are coming." Another call interrupted them, this time from radiology. Their scheduling board had wiped clean for exactly 6 minutes before restoring itself. The technicians thought it was a network glitch. The new nurse asked a simple question. "Did the clock reset with it?" Silence on the line. "Yes," the technician admitted. She wrote the time down. At 3:04 a.m., the overhead lights dimmed briefly, less than a second, barely noticeable unless someone was watching the monitors. Several machines beeped and recalibrated automatically. She did notice. Without raising her voice, she spoke while adjusting a patient's blanket. "Let's move all battery backups to active charge now, just in case maintenance runs a test." The charge nurse hesitated, then nodded to a technician. It sounded reasonable. The technician later assumed administration had requested it. Another stretcher arrived. This patient had a fever, but no infection source listed. The lab labels attached to the chart used an external facility code none of them recognized. The attending physician flipped through pages. Where did these people come from? No one could answer. The new nurse stepped closer, careful not to interrupt. "We should isolate febrile admissions until labs confirm," she suggested. "Just precaution." The physician looked tired, not dismissive. "We don't have the rooms." "You do," she said, pointing subtly to the earlier bed changes she had made. "2 are already ready." He followed her gesture and realized the spaces had been prepared before the patients existed. He agreed without further question. At 3:12 a.m., the hospital paging system activated unintentionally. A brief burst of static across every speaker. Then silence. Engineering reported no manual trigger. The new nurse's gaze lifted to the ceiling for only a moment. Then she began moving chart folders into a specific order at the station. Respiratory cases together, unknown exposure cases together, stable trauma separated entirely. The organization looked like routine efficiency, but it allowed any staff member to understand priorities without instructions. A senior nurse approached her. "You're reorganizing like a drill." "Just making it easier to see," she answered. Another ambulance call came through. This time, security reported vehicles circling the parking structure but not entering. Dark, unmarked. The charge nurse walked to the window but saw nothing from her angle. The new nurse did not look outside. Instead, she called dietary services. "Pause meal deliveries to this wing for 30 minutes, she requested politely. "We may need hallway clearance." They complied, assuming emergency admissions required space. At 3:19 a.m., an administrator demanded explanations over the phone. Insurance verification failing, intake logs incomplete, multiple outside agencies requesting bed counts without identifying themselves. The staff felt the tension now. Not panic, but a loss of normal procedure. Questions no one could answer. The new nurse began assigning small tasks to whoever stood nearest, always framed as help. "Could you close those fire doors halfway? It reduces hallway noise for patients." "Can you print blank wristbands? Registration is catching up." "Let's stage oxygen tanks here so transport doesn't search later." Each suggestion solved a problem before it was noticed. At 3:26 a.m., the power flickered again. Longer this time. Generators did not engage because the outage was incomplete. The building felt briefly suspended between systems. A patient monitor alarmed across the ward. She reached it first and silenced it only after confirming the reading manually. Artifact, not cardiac. She repositioned the sensor and left the alarm volume lower than default. Enough for staff, not enough for hallway panic. The attending physician approached her quietly. "You've worked disaster intake before," she shook her head. "I've worked crowded nights." He studied her for a second, then returned to his patients without pressing further. At 3:31 a.m., the sound reached them. Faint but unmistakable. Rotor blades. Too large for police aviation, too low for transit air routes. Security radios crackled across the corridor as guards ran toward elevators. Someone mentioned the roof. The charge nurse stepped toward the window again, confused. "We didn't request air transport." The new nurse finally stopped moving. She listened, counting silently between passes of the blades, measuring distance, approach speed, weight. Then she picked up the internal phone and dialed the operator. "Please clear the rooftop access corridors," she said calmly. "Medical equipment transport is incoming." The operator hesitated. "We have no notice." You will in a moment, she replied gently. It will be easier if no one is there. She hung up before questions followed. The helicopter sound intensified, vibrating faintly through the ceiling structure. Staff gathered near doorways despite themselves, pulled by instinct toward the unknown. The new nurse instead began relocating 2 nurses away from the central station to patient rooms, not urgently, simply giving them tasks that placed them safely behind doors. At 3:36 a.m., every internal phone rang simultaneously, not sequentially, all at once. The charge nurse stared at the blinking console before answering. She listened for 3 seconds, her expression drained of color. Slowly, she held the receiver toward the new nurse. "They're asking for someone," she whispered. "I think you." The ward fell silent, except for the distant thunder of rotors overhead. The new nurse took the phone. She did not identify herself. She only listened. Her posture straightened almost imperceptibly. Not tense, not surprised. "Familiar." "Yes," she said at last. Nothing more. She returned the receiver gently to its cradle and looked around the ward, confirming positions, exits, and distances in a single measured glance. Then she walked toward the elevators as the helicopter settled onto the roof above them. No one stopped her. No one yet understood why they felt they shouldn't. The elevator doors opened to a corridor filled with movement that did not belong to a hospital. Security officers stood uncertainly along the walls, while several uniformed personnel spoke in low, precise voices near the stairwell. They were not loud, not aggressive, but they occupied space differently, as if they expected it to function around them. The new nurse did not approach them. She turned instead to the rooftop access panel and swiped a temporary badge she had been issued during orientation. The lock remained red. One of the uniformed men stepped forward. "Ma'am, roof access is restricted." She looked at the indicator light, not at him. "You landed heavier than your manifest weight. The outer stairwell hinges will bind if too many enter at once. Use the service lift in groups of 4. The man paused. He raised his radio but did not speak immediately. He studied her for half a second, then relayed the instruction exactly as given. No one asked how she knew. She returned to the elevator and descended before the first team reached the door. When she stepped back onto the ward, the atmosphere had changed. Not panic, pressure. Staff moved faster, spoke quieter. The unknown had become real, and real problems demanded action. The charge nurse met her immediately. "Who are they? They won't tell administration anything." "They're here because something followed those patients," she said calmly. "Not a person, a condition." The words were careful, chosen to inform without alarming. The attending physician approached. "Infectious?" "Possibly," she answered, "but inconsistent. Treat as exposure control until confirmed." He accepted that without argument, though questions filled his expression. She began assigning actions, never as orders. "We should separate airflow between these rooms. We'll want waste containers sealed before transport. Let's avoid shared equipment for the next hour." Each suggestion solved a problem the staff had not yet identified. Within minutes, the ward reorganized itself around her phrasing. She did not raise her voice, yet movement aligned with her decisions. A senior doctor objected when she recommended suspending routine admissions. "We can't close the floor based on uncertainty." She met his eyes evenly. "Then delay them for 15 minutes. If I'm wrong, you lose 15 minutes. If I'm right, you keep the hospital open." He hesitated, then nodded once. 15 minutes cost nothing. The military team entered through the corridor moments later, escorted but not guided. They scanned rooms, equipment, ventilation panels, not patients. Their attention followed a logic the staff could not interpret. One of them approached her directly. "We need patient sequence order from arrival." She handed over the clipboard she had prepared before the helicopter landed. He flipped through it, then looked at her with quiet recognition. "You already mapped progression." Only timing, she replied. He gave a slight nod and moved on. The charge nurse watched this exchange carefully but said nothing. A sudden alarm sounded from the far room, oxygen saturation dropping rapidly in one of the febrile patients. Staff rushed instinctively, but she raised a hand slightly. "Mask first," she said softly, "then enter." They paused just long enough to follow the instruction. The patient coughed violently as they stabilized him, but no one else in the room was exposed directly. Containment held. In the hallway, an administrator demanded explanations from the arriving officers. The response remained the same. Operational necessity, no details. Frustration grew, but the ward continued functioning because the immediate tasks were clear. She moved from bed to bed, checking seals on equipment, confirming airflow direction with a strip of tape held near door frames, repositioning staff without them realizing they were being repositioned. Each adjustment prevented a future problem rather than fixing a current one. A nurse whispered to another, "She's running this floor." The other replied, "No one told her to." Near the nursing station, the attending physician reviewed lab samples. "Results are delayed, system still unstable." She leaned slightly closer. "Do not wait for labs to decide containment." He glanced at her. "You're certain?" "I'm certain delay increases risk." He closed the chart. "Then we proceed." The military team leader returned. "We'll require temporary corridor control." She considered the layout for less than a second. "Close the east stairwell instead. It keeps emergency exit capacity but limits cross-traffic." He studied the map, then signaled his team to follow her recommendation without modification. Authority had shifted, though no declaration was made. An hour earlier, she had been invisible. Now decisions flowed through her presence without introduction, without rank spoken aloud. The cost appeared gradually. Staff fatigue rose from sustained tension, and she absorbed questions directed at others, sparing them interruption. She repeated instructions calmly to families, accepted complaints about restrictions, and stood longest in the hallway most exposed to traffic. When a frightened patient tried to leave isolation, she spoke with him for several minutes until he returned willingly. No security intervention, no restraint. Restraint mattered. At 4:18 a.m., the ventilation system cycled unexpectedly, reversing pressure in 2 rooms. She reacted immediately, sealing one door and opening another to redirect airflow manually until engineering corrected the setting. The adjustment prevented contaminated air from entering the central ward. Only the military technicians noticed how quickly she calculated the correction. The team leader approached once more, quieter now. "We're stabilizing the external situation. We'll need this area maintained for another hour." "It will hold," she said. He hesitated. "You didn't have to stay inside the corridor." She adjusted a patient's IV line before answering. They needed continuity. He accepted that answer without asking further. By the time the first signs of containment success appeared, stabilized vitals, no secondary symptoms, the ward had been functioning under her direction for nearly an hour. No announcement marked the change. No introduction explained it. Yet every person present understood, without discussing it, that the floor was operating exactly as it needed to, because she was there. By 4:37 a.m., the pace had slowed, but the pressure had not lifted. Stability in a crisis was not safety. It was only a pause long enough for the next decision to matter more. The febrile patient who had arrived second, the one whose documents did not match any facility code, began deteriorating without following a predictable pattern. His oxygen levels held, his heart remained steady, yet neurological responses lagged behind stimulation by several seconds. Not unconscious, not responsive. The attending physician reviewed the chart twice. "This doesn't behave like infection." "No," she said quietly. "It behaves like exposure." The physician looked toward the military team positioned down the corridor. "Exposure to what?" She did not answer. Instead, she watched the airflow indicator she had taped beside the doorframe. The thin strip fluttered inward, then outward, then steadied. Ventilation control was holding, but only barely. The building systems had not been designed for uncertainty this precise. The team leader approached with a sealed case and spoke low enough for only her and the physician to hear. "We have confirmation. The source patient must be moved to controlled containment. Immediately." The physician frowned. "He won't survive transport in this state." "He may not survive remaining here," the officer replied. Silence stretched between them. Moving the patient would risk the transport team. Leaving him risk the entire ward if containment failed even briefly. Both options carried cost. The difference was who would pay it. The physician looked to her. Not because of rank, none had been spoken, but because every correct decision so far had passed through her judgment. She studied the room, then the hallway, then the distance to the service elevator. Her eyes tracked the route like a map already memorized. "Prepare a portable barrier," she said. "Plastic sheeting, double mask protocol, no powered ventilation during transfer." The officer nodded once and relayed it. The physician hesitated. "You're sending them into exposure." She shook her head slightly. "No, I am minimizing duration." The staff gathered equipment with controlled urgency. No one rushed, yet movement became precise, each person aware the next minutes mattered more than the last hour. When the barrier was ready, she stepped toward the isolation room door. The charge nurse caught her arm. "You don't need to be the one inside." She met her gaze calmly. "They don't know his baseline reactions." "You can brief them." Briefing costs time. The charge nurse understood what she was not saying. Unfamiliar hands increased unpredictable movement. Unpredictable movement increased exposure. Cost again. And she was choosing who paid it. She entered the room. Inside, the air felt heavier despite the filtered masks. The patient's eyes moved slowly toward her, tracking with effort. She adjusted his IV, spoke softly so his breathing would not spike, and coordinated with the team outside through the glass using small gestures instead of words. When he panicked during repositioning, she steadied his shoulder and waited instead of forcing compliance. 30 seconds passed. Then another 30. Heart rate stabilized. They continued. The transfer took less than 2 minutes, but she remained inside long enough to secure every seal personally before stepping back into the corridor. The officer immediately held out a clean mask replacement. "You exceeded recommended contact duration." "Yes," she said, removing her gloves carefully. "We reduced 3 additional entries." He did not argue. Halfway to the service elevator, the patient convulsed unexpectedly. The transport team froze for a fraction of a second, long enough to risk dropping the seal. She placed both hands firmly on the stretcher rail. "Hold position," she said, voice even. "Wait." They waited. The convulsion passed without rupture of the barrier. Had they continued moving, containment might have broken at the doorway threshold, the most dangerous point in the corridor. Restraint prevented exposure. They resumed and reached the elevator without further incident. Once the doors closed, she leaned briefly against the wall. Not exhaustion, calculation ending after sustained tension. The cost appeared now in slower breathing, in the way she flexed her fingers to maintain circulation. The charge nurse noticed the tremor she tried to hide. "You should get checked." In a moment, she walked instead to the nurse's station and rewrote assignments so no one who assisted the transfer would treat immunocompromised patients for the rest of the shift. Quiet protection, unnoticed by most. Minutes later, the team leader returned from containment below. "Area secured? No spread detected." Relief moved through the staff like released pressure. Conversations resumed cautiously. Someone exhaled a laugh they did not realize they were holding. He turned to her privately. "You accepted unnecessary exposure." She shook her head. "Necessary. Fewer contacts means fewer unknown variables." He studied her for a long second. "You're still operating like you own the outcome." She did not respond. Instead, she signed the last temporary chart, removed her isolation gown, and placed it in the biohazard container with deliberate care, sealing it completely before stepping away. The ward continued functioning because she remained standing, but now the cost had been paid, not in injury, not in recognition, but in risk carried personally, so no one else had to calculate it, and she never mentioned it once. Dawn approached quietly as it always did in hospitals, not with sunlight, but with paperwork. By 5:22 a.m., the ward no longer felt suspended. Machines returned to routine alarms, footsteps lost urgency. The night shift began preparing reports for people who would never see the tension that had filled the corridors hours earlier. The isolation room downstairs remained sealed. The military personnel moved with less intensity now, documenting rather than reacting. Whatever had threatened the hospital had been contained before it could become visible. Most staff only understood that something serious had happened. They did not understand how close it had come. The new nurse sat at the station completing charting she had delayed. Her handwriting remained steady despite the long hours. She recorded only patient facts. No explanations, no speculation, leaving the record clean and ordinary. The charge nurse watched her for a moment. "They're asking for you downstairs." She closed the file before answering. "I know." She stood, removed her identification badge, and placed it on the counter. "Please mark my shift completed." "You're leaving early?" "My assignment here is finished." The charge nurse opened her mouth to question it, then stopped. The sentence had not sounded like a request or resignation. It sounded like a fact. Downstairs, in a conference room rarely used during nights, 3 officials waited with the team leader. No uniforms visible now, only plain jackets and sealed folders on the table. One of them spoke first. "Containment verified, external risk neutralized, no civilian exposure beyond the initial group." She nodded once. Another slid a document toward her. "We'll need a statement for internal review." She read it without sitting. "Remove line 7. Staff response was independent." It was coordinated. "It was not informed," she corrected gently. "They acted professionally without context. That matters." The official studied her, then marked the change. The team leader spoke last. "Your presence prevented escalation." She shook her head slightly. "Their cooperation prevented escalation." He did not argue, but his expression suggested the distinction was noted. A sealed envelope was placed on the table. She did not open it. She slipped it into her pocket without checking the contents. "No follow-up required," one official asked. "None. Symptoms resolved within predicted window." "Monitoring period?" 48 hours for the initial contacts," she replied. "Routine checkups will be enough." The meeting ended without signatures exchanged publicly, without titles spoken aloud. When she returned upstairs, the day shift had begun arriving, carrying coffee, discussing ordinary concerns, unaware of helicopters or sealed corridors hours earlier. One nurse noticed the reorganized supply stations. "Who changed the layout?" The charge nurse looked at the empty chair beside the computer. "Night shift adjustment, we're keeping it." The attending physician checked the updated procedures printed near the desk. "These make sense. We should have done this years ago." No one realized they were reading instructions written to handle a crisis they would never know existed. She went to the locker room, removed the hospital scrubs, and folded them neatly on the bench. Her personal clothes were simple, unremarkable. When she emerged, she looked like a visitor leaving early rather than staff ending a shift. At the exit desk, security glanced up. "You forgot to sign the incident log." "There was no incident," she said calmly. He checked the empty form, uncertain why that felt correct, and nodded. Outside, morning light softened the parking lot. The helicopter sat silent on the roof, unseen from the ground. By the time the day staff would look up, it would be gone. She walked past the ambulance bay without slowing. The same vehicles were parked, now ordinary again. Behind her, the hospital resumed its normal rhythm, but with doors that closed differently, supplies stored differently, and staff unconsciously following patterns they had learned in a single night. At the corner of the street, a dark vehicle waited briefly. The team leader stepped out just long enough to speak. "Your transfer orders are ready." She considered the building one last time. "They'll manage." "They already are," he said. She gave a small nod, neither satisfied nor regretful, and entered the car. By the time the sun reached the upper windows, the helicopter lifted off without announcement. Inside the hospital, the new nurse's name remained on the schedule, but no one could remember exactly when she had arrived, only that the night had been handled, and that somehow everyone had known what to do.